going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then we can get started. So Dr. Alice Lee Williams Brown is joining us today. Dr. Brown serves as the principal of AWB and Associates, which has consulted with various universities and nonprofit organizations on fundraising and avoiding closure. Previously, she served as the director and then president of the Appalachian College Association, the ACA, at the University of Kentucky from 1983 to 2008. During her 15 years as president of the ACA, she raised almost $50 million from approximately 20 major foundations and federal agencies. She serves on the board of the Skelly Foundation and previously served on the boards of the Southern Education Foundation, Colby-Story College, HERS, the Association of Collaborative Leadership, and the Appalachian Studies Association, among others. She has received 6 honorary degrees and numerous awards, including Distinguished Alumnus of Appalachian State in 2010. Her recent publications include 50 Million for Faculty and Students, My Fundraising Years, How Boards Lead Small Colleges, and Staying the Course, Unflinching Dedication and Persistence Have Built a Successful Private College in a Region of Isolation and Poverty. She earned her bachelor's and master's from Appalachian State University and her doctorate in education from the University of Kentucky. We also have here Dr. Robert Dickeson. Dr. Dickeson is the co-founder of Academic Strategy Partners, now the Academic Strategy Consortium, which provides expert consultation to colleges, universities, and other organizations to improve institutional leadership systems and processes, governance, planning, enrollment management, performance analytics, and financial standing. A national leader in higher education, Dr. Dickeson served as the president of the University of Northern Colorado from 1981 to 1991. He has chaired Blue Ribbon Commissions appointed by 3 governors in 2 states. He has been an officer of 80 corporate, government, foundation, and public affairs organizations, and served as the commissioner from Colorado to the Education Commission of the states. He is the author of more than 175 publications in fields of higher education leadership and policy and public administration. Dr. Dickeson's book, Prioritizing Academic Programs and Services, is based on his extensive consulting experiences serving several hundred 2- and 4-year colleges and corporations ranging from hospitals to bank holding companies. Dr. Dickeson holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in political science and public administration from the University of Missouri at Columbia. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Matthew Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks is the founder of Perspective Data Science, a data consultancy firm that provides organizations, particularly those in the education sector, operating on small budgets with state-of-the-art analytics. He works with institutions to help them make better policy decisions that promote financial stability and improve student outcomes. Dr. Hendricks previously served as the chair of the Department of Economics and was an associate professor of economics at the University of Tulsa, where his scholarship focused on labor economics, applied econometrics, and education policy. His research on the impact of changes in base salaries on teacher productivity was published in the Journal of Public Economics and Economics of Education Review. Dr. Hendricks holds a bachelor's in economics from St. John's University and a PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. So again, thank you all for joining us today. As a data analyst, one of the reasons that I wanted to have this webinar was because we are seeing schools closing at an increasing rate. We're also seeing college spending increase at the same time. And so we wanted to actually talk to boards to make sure that people can make those decisions and make changes at their institutions to keep schools from closing. So Dr. Hendricks, I'm going to start with you since you were the most recently at the University of Tulsa. While you were a professor at the University of Tulsa, you started looking into Tulsa's finances. Can you talk about a little bit what was happening on campus and what inspired you to look into your college's spending?
Yeah, a little bit before I get going. I'm on a vacation right now on a Disney cruise line, so if my connection's unstable, you can just bounce around and I'll try to get back on. But yeah, what was going on? So there's a whole, it maybe took a couple of years of sequence of events. The first one was they cut all the faculty, all the staff's retirement benefits, and the explanation was that we're facing enrollment troubles and sort of the standard stuff. We have headwinds, and our budget wasn't balanced. And then that was in about 2017 or 16, I believe. And then a couple of years after that, they proposed made a big announcement that they were going to cut 40% of the academic programs at the University of Tulsa. And again, that was sold to us as a way to sort of balance the budget, and we were facing budget issues, and that was our best option, is to cut programs that were sort of low enrolled or weren't seemingly profitable to the institution. So that was sort of what was going on, and that motivated me to start digging into higher education data for the first time, really. That was about 2 or 3 years ago, and what I found basically was that a lot of sort of groundwork that should have led up to making that decision hadn't really been done. I think initially I thought that when I first looked at it, so basically what I found with the data was that the University of Tulsa did have a budget problem, of course, but it was not, we had a huge spending problem basically, but it wasn't in instructional spending, which is where they were targeting all of the cuts. Our instructional spending looked quite good, actually, and about average for our peer institutions, but we were very high in some other areas like institutional support, academic support, auxiliary enterprise. And so I started asking questions basically that, why are we cutting these programs when it seems, that you would cut those last after sort of right sizing other budgets first. So I basically started asking a whole bunch of questions and digging into data and starting to answer those questions the best I could with the data, which is actually can answer most questions with data actually. And that's one of the points I want to get across today, is that the time of making decisions in higher ed, you don't have to make any decisions in higher ed really based on assumptions or guesses. You can check. There's right answers to a lot of the questions you can ask. And it just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of money to find the answers. And that's what I'm trying to provide to higher ed actually. Beyond TU, I'm doing this full time now, as Anna mentioned in the introduction. But I don't know if I go too long-winded on basically, I don't know if you want the whole story, but it took several years, and eventually part of my analysis and of course they hired other outside consulting firms that basically confirmed what I was saying, that we have these spending issues in other areas. Particularly lots of extra staff in various departments that load into academic support and auxiliary enterprise and institutional support. And essentially what happened was the big rollout of the cutting of all the programs turned into, it just kind of went away and quietly let that die and made the right cuts eventually. But it's a sad story, really. I mean, it would have taken probably 2 weeks to figure out, answer the first question. Why do we have a budget problem? It's a spending problem. Okay. Where is the spending high? All right. That's the next obvious question. Why is it high? Which the answer is obvious. We had a ton of extra staff. And then finally, how do you fix it? Right. And ultimately that's what they did. But it was really painful and embarrassing, and a number of people lost their jobs actually because of it. So it didn't need to happen. That's basically the point I want to make in this webinar. Don't guess, don't assume, check, right? Ask questions and check for the answer. It's pretty rare now that you can't find an answer in the data.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I mean, that was really helpful. And I do want to get back to you about the reaction at Tulsa. But before then, so I mean, the data, Dr. Hendricks works with the data, and the data, it sounds like, is telling you a lot. But I want to talk about sort of what those numbers actually say when you're on the campus. So Dr. Dickeson, could you talk a little bit about when you're working with institutions, where you see institutions spending too much, and also what happens when they start prioritizing things that they need to be prioritizing and where they should be prioritizing?
Sure, be happy to. I think we have to remind trustees of several things that I think are taken for granted and are probably wrong. The first among these is, when you are faced with a budget cut, the political instinct is to cut everything across the board. Let's say we have a 3% problem, so I'll eat 3% and you eat 3% and we'll sing Kumbaya and everybody's happy. That's politically expedient, but it's also academically irresponsible. And the reason is that some programs are more important than others. And this is very hard for the culture of a campus to accept, but it's the truth. Some programs are more important than others. Not all programs are equal. Some are more effective, some are more efficient, some are more central to your mission. And so I guess a rule of thumb, whether we're talking about academic programs or administrative programs, would be something like this. What programs do we truly need, and which programs do our people do well? And so that's two criteria. One is demand and one is quality. Now, my book goes off and recommends 10 criteria, which most people choke on, but let me just say that most institutions of higher education in this country are overprogrammed for their resources. They're trying to be all things to all people. They're trying to do too much with the available resources. If you learn one thing from the gospel according to Bob today, it would be that the most likely source of resources for your institution is going to come from reallocation of existing resources. It's nice to pray about incoming revenue is going to be increased somehow. We're going to get great grants, or some alum is going to die and leave us a ton of money, or something else is going to happen that's magical. It's going to cause us to break out of this. The reality is we're going to have the money we're spending now, the millions of dollars that are in your current budgets. You got to ask as a trustee, are we spending this as wisely as possible? Are there better ways? And reallocation of resources from lower priorities to higher priorities requires us to undergo some kind of priority setting process. And that's what I think is important. It's possible to reallocate resources from academic programs and administrative non-academic programs, and we could go on and on about it. But I think we need to focus on the programs that we do well and that are needed. And there are ways to measure that. I think that's enough for now, but I think that in terms of the basic advice, that would be a place to start.
Okay. I mean, I think that's really interesting. And actually, I know Dr. Hendricks' dashboard, and you do look at the individual programs that students are enrolled in. So that's one place to start. I will say these all sound like very difficult conversations to have on campus. I mean, laying people off is not something that can be done lightly. So Dr. Brown, I wanted to talk to you about that. When you're having these, you've worked with lots of boards, so when you're having these difficult conversations, what's something that boards need to keep in mind when they are having these conversations about the budget and what to cut and what not to cut?
Well, the sad thing I learned, and you realize I worked primarily in my career with colleges that were rural, small, denominational, and close to closing, financially struggling, and always looking for the one answer for the next year without thinking about the next 10 years. So I'm used to dealing with colleges that are weak from the beginning and have all kinds of obstacles ahead of them. Now, I will tell you that when I first started with the Appalachian College Association, I was working mainly with the faculty. And then I was really impressed with the work of most of the faculty, especially faculty. I mean, somebody pointed out, well, I only saw the good faculty because they were the ones that applied for our fellowships. But anyway, I was really impressed with them, but I realized pretty quickly that they don't really have any power in terms of administration and what's going to be cut and how they're going to survive another couple of years. So I formed an organization of the deans, the academic deans, thinking, okay, these deans can save the colleges. And what happened is I realized these deans are overwhelmed. You know, they don't really have assistant deans. And so every time the president drops something on their desk, they're the ones that has to do it or has to deal with it. Then I decided, okay, I'll get a group of the presidents. I will have an organization that is governed by the presidents. We left the University of Kentucky, formed a 501c3. largely because the University of Kentucky had a new president who couldn't quite figure out why the university was spending time and resources working with 35 colleges when only 7 of them were in Kentucky. At any rate, we formed an organization, the presidents became the board, and I have to say, I was repeatedly shocked by how closed they were. There wasn't any transparency. I mean, they didn't really want you to know what was happening in their school. And they themselves didn't really want to admit what was happening in their school, as far as I could tell. So then I said, okay, I'll work with trustees. And I worked with Elizabeth Hayford, who had been president of the Associated Colleges of the Midwest for about as long, or actually a little longer than I had been with the ACA. And what I found was that, well, oh gosh, I can't remember his name, but one of the guys that, which name will come to me, I'm sure, was asked, a prominent person who was on a board. They asked him what he did, and he said, well, we ate well. And so that's sort of, I think, the conclusion that most trustees have. They come there to support the president, even when the president might be wrong. They come there to have a nice dinner and maybe go to a ball game. So my suggestion, when you talk about how can trustees prepare themselves for difficult budgets, is, first of all, they need to get more different trustees for the most part. You know, Bill Bowen says in his book that the main thing a trustee needs to have is courage. And they need to have courage to be able to act when they really need to act. When hard decisions have to be made, they need to do something besides postpone them till the next meeting. And so, I don't really know. I think it's sad that the colleges that need the most, need the trustees, strong trustees, generally don't have them. They have people who are friends of the college, but they don't have a lot of money, and they don't have a lot of clout. Now, one of the schools that I haven't worked with much, but I know about it, Catawba, which is here in North Carolina, just had a trustee give them $200 million. Now, that's the kind of trustee you want on your board. Or you want a trustee who knows people who can give them money. You need a trustee who's going to do something. And one of the things that has fascinated me about the private colleges that I never realized before is how, first of all, they don't have to give you any information, but they have control in a way that public institutions don't. The state institutions, I was amazed to find, really, it's the governing board at the university system that makes the real decisions. One college even told me they can't even select their own commencement speakers. So anyway, but I guess the question really is, how do you get good board members on the board of weak colleges? Now, Derek Bach has said something, and somebody else has said something similar. A man in California who has looked a lot at these same kind of colleges. But Bach said, the colleges that take students with modest entering abilities and improves their abilities substantially contributes more to the nation than the school that takes very bright students and helps them develop only modestly. And, I've heard repeatedly that if you take a kid from a disadvantaged background who without college is probably going to end up on welfare, and give him a solid background and he gets a good job, even if he's not a surgeon or somebody in the field that we think of people as having when they're in good jobs, that is really better than sending a kid to Harvard to be a doctor, when that kid, if you didn't do anything for him, would probably manage to, with the resources he had at hand, to become successful. So I wish we could figure out how to get more people interested in the colleges that are struggling. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do that. Center College has done a masterful job in Kentucky, and they have had trustees from the beginning who, one, believed the mission of the school firmly and held to it no matter what, and who almost went door to door helping raise money. The other thing that Center does is people who give money to the college talk to the students who are graduating about the importance of giving money to the college. And they have the highest alumni giving rate in the nation, or they did at least a couple of years ago. Now, how do trustees know if their school is at risk of closing? This is the other thing that has amazed me about trustees. They don't get out. They don't see students. They don't see anybody except the president and maybe a couple of other administrators. Even if they meet with the faculty over dinner, they don't really have a chance to see them in action or to get out to the campus. And they assume in many cases that they shouldn't do that. They shouldn't go to admissions and ask questions. And they shouldn't go to the finance office and ask questions. So they only know what they're told in those board meetings. If a trustee just walks around the campus, and the first time I walked around the campus, I shouldn't say where, there were like half a dozen buildings that were boarded up. And they were, well, I would say, well, what's that? They'd say, that's for storage. Well, the fact is, it was deferred maintenance. They couldn't make the building livable or usable. So it shouldn't take you too long to figure out if this college has something in it. There's a guide that turnaround colleges that Martin and Simmels wrote, not 2009, I think. And he gives a list of 15 criteria. Now, in many cases, the trustees don't have a clue whether or not the 10% that the budget is whatever percent higher than the debt. So the question, the things that, how do they know if their school is at risk of closing? They need to get out and walk around and ask questions. And I think trustees have that authority.
Well, I'm glad you bring, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to get Dr. Hendricks, I want to get your opinion because I'm glad you're bringing up sort of these trustees actually reaching out to other offices on campus instead of just sitting in the boardroom. So Dr. Hendricks, you've worked with alumni groups and faculty groups of schools that are financially closing. Have you noticed which groups are sort of more willing to listen to you and more willing to make changes?
Yeah, well, I think generally when we get down to talking about making cuts to staff, of course, the staff that want to listen to me are the ones that are on the chopping block, right? So I actually had an interesting conversation with one of my partners. I work with a large consulting company on with big colleges, and one of the things we found is a lot of the salaries looked quite high for the upper administrators, and I was like, well, how do we present that to? Well, the advice that individual gave me, I thought was really good. I mean, and basically what I follow too is just stick to the facts, right? I mean, just be transparent, show the all stakeholders, including the ones that are at risk of losing their jobs, what our numbers look like, your numbers look like, versus what a normal, like what you expected to see for numbers of staff and salary for those particular jobs. And we can get it quite accurate. And in some cases, you can look at numbers and say, well, that seems high, but you should always verify these things and just show. I think the more transparent we are, the more we rely on objective facts, the better. And even I think in that case, even though it's quite painful for the people that lose their jobs, I think they can understand at least why the institution is moving in that direction. I think it's just healthy for everybody. So I try to follow that the best I can.
Okay.
Matt, I hate to say this, but most of the colleges I worked with, transparency was a dirty word. And, they just didn't.
That would
go ahead.
Gotta change that. Yeah. It's kind of weird too, because if they're not transparent, I mean, my institution was that way too, and they're trying to, my old institution, they're trying to get more transparent, and it's very dangerous to be non-transparent because a lot of data is public, even for a private school, and it can be quite embarrassing if you're making decisions that aren't sort of justified by what we can see in the data. So I think just in general, a good leader is going to be transparent, explain why they're making the decisions they are, base it on objective facts. And if you do that, you'll be fine. And you'll still probably make mistakes, but you can correct those, right? This is why we made the decision before. It made sense. Now we have new information. Maybe it doesn't make sense now. Really simple. I don't think, being transparent is not a dirty word. It should be actually what saves you. It makes a long career for you as a board member or a university leader, any kind of leader for that matter. More transparency is going to be helpful for you, so your constituents see why you make the decisions you do. When they don't see it, they're going to fill in reasons for you, right? Which aren't probably going to be flattering for your reputation. So
I want to give you one quick example, Matt, of the problems with transparency at my schools. After I'd worked with these schools for 15 years, maybe 20 at that point, the Spencer Foundation offered us money to do a study on the alumni of our 35 small private colleges and the public regional universities in those states to look at graduates 5, 15, and 25 years out. And I could only get 10 of the 35 to agree to participate. They didn't have to pay anything. They just had, in fact, we were working with Pasquarello and Terenzini, and the University of Iowa was going to do the research that would find addresses for alumni that the school no longer could find. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons to do this. And, you know, one president said, well, I know we have problems. We just don't want the rest of the world to know about them. You know, so that's the scary thing to me, is if they're going to close their boundaries and not let anybody in, and they're not going to get any information out, I don't know what the hope is. I did have, and I did have one more. You had asked me who is often in denial about the future of their school. You know, it's almost like they believe that if they talk about the negatives will come to reality. That they don't want to mention the possibility that they don't have enough money to last more than a year and a half, or they might not have enough money. You know, presidents, the schools I worked with, few of them had more than 1,000 students, and they had small endowments, so they didn't have reserves of any amount. The presidents I felt like most of the presidents that I was working with kept their head in the sand and optimistically claimed that, well, we've had problems before, we got through those, we'll get through these. And that's not a very good scenario for the future. But anyway, I have lots of examples of opportunities that these schools passed up because, you know, at one point I had a fellowship review committee of the graduate deans of 6 research universities in our region. And the graduate deans offered to send ABD students to the colleges that had fellowships to replace them, because the deans were complaining about, if I give a fellowship to one of my faculty gets a fellowship and goes away for a year, I have to find a replacement. Not one of the 35 schools, not Berea, not Swanee, and those were my 2 schools that really were exceptions to most of these policies. None of them wanted those people on their campus. Anyway, it's just, I'm not very optimistic about the future of most of these schools. So when you talk about my consulting with schools that were close to closing or were considering closing or were looking at the possibility, I should tell you that my nickname was, I was known as the Dr. Kevorkian of private higher education. You know, if I came to your campus, it probably meant you were going to die. So I'm not a savior, and I don't think I was ever viewed as one. But that's my offerings from the questions you asked me.
Well, I appreciate the honesty, even if you're not optimistic. Dr. Dickeson, I want to also give you a chance to respond to the transparency issues. Do you see these? I mean, is this something that you've seen when working with institutions? And are you as pessimistic as Dr. Brown?
No, I'm not. I want to differ with my colleagues. I see trustees becoming more and more engaged. And I think that we need to promote engagement. We certainly need to promote transparency. Private institutions particularly have a tradition of keeping things quiet, like salaries and other matters. We also have a tendency historically, I think, to do what I call noble lying. We'll say to a faculty meeting, well, things are really great here, when in fact they're not. And so when things go bad, things go bump in the night, faculty are the first to say, well, what happened? I thought things were great here. Well, it's because we didn't shoot straight with them. I think most people who work on a university campus consider themselves a part of the community, want to be involved. They don't want to run things necessarily, and they shouldn't, but they do need to understand what's going on. So I think trustees are becoming more engaged, and I think there are some specifics that they can tackle besides just walking around. I would hope that there's a solid committee structure in which trustees work with faculty on a variety of problems and issues, get their hands dirty. Some of them are willing to do this. Most of our trustees have extraordinary experiences in the business world or government or education or the arts, and they bring to the table more than the hope for money. They bring with them that experience and the insights and perhaps a fresh look at things. And we need a fresh look at things, particularly when this whole area of administrative or middle management glut. All of our institutions can stand a little more streamlining with respect to processes. We spend a ton of money on processes. I mean, how many signatures does it take to get something approved? And if the seventh signature is there only because the sixth person has signed it, it's absurd. One of the things that I like to do is to, whenever I'm discussing what's going on, I'll say, what doesn't make sense around here anymore? And we start listing those, and you'd be surprised how many crazy policies are accomplished and continued simply because we've always done it that way. And it's time, I think, for trustees and others to stop and blow the whistle and say, wait a minute, we can do this better. We can streamline things. We can do things a little more smartly. One example, let's say there's a new requirement from the accounting rules. The accounting rules change on a regular basis and something new is required. We don't have to hire a full-time person to do that, but that's what often happens. We need to perhaps look at jobs from a desk audit point of view and say, okay, what this person is doing maybe was required 20 years ago, but is no longer required. Let's adjust what the individual is doing, or we shift responsibilities, or we can do cross-training. There's any number of techniques that I think can be used that will not only enable us to become more efficient, but more effective. And I think that there are tools. I think most trustees and most presidents are motivated to do the right thing, but they need some tools to be able to help them do that. And that's where I think ACTA and other associations and other professionals and some of the books we've been talking about provide those tools. I think that engagement is critical. And I think that's one of the tenets that ACTA has been advancing, and I applaud that sincerely. I believe that academics and other matters that are not hands-off, the trustees have a responsibility and even a duty to get into the middle of these things and discover what we can do better. And I think one of my favorite authors is Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School, who once said, what to do is a tough decision. What not to do is a tougher decision. What to stop doing is the toughest decision. And I think it's time for some of the toughest decisions to be made.
Yeah. Do you have any success stories of schools that were able to sort of use these tools and reallocate funds in ways that kept the school thriving?
Absolutely. I would say that the majority of schools I've worked with, and I've worked with several hundred now in the United States and Canada, have used these processes for a variety of reasons. One, to cut budgets, and that has ranged from 3 to 5% over a 2-year period on a general basis. Second, to become more efficient. Third, to be able to meet accreditation responsibilities. There's a number of accrediting agencies, regional associations that are required now that are saying that institutions are over-programmed for the resources, and unless they do something, they're going to lose accreditation. And so that's been it. It also enables a better look at strategic planning. I think priority setting, reallocation, and strategic planning go hand in hand. And finally, I think it helps with integrated planning. We have a capital improvements plan and an enrollment management plan, and all of these plans rarely talk to each other. But I think priority setting and reallocation dovetails nicely with those. So yeah, I think most of the institutions that I've worked with are indeed success stories. There's a few examples where things haven't gone right. Generally, I guess if I were to identify the three things that are needed to be successful, number one is alignment. We got to have the board and the president, the chief academic officer, and the chief financial officer in alignment about what needs to be done and how we're going to be doing it. If those individuals or groups are not in alignment, forget about it. Don't even start. You're in trouble to begin with. Second is data. As my colleagues have mentioned, data are critical. This is not about good old boy networks anymore, or you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, or the other kinds of things that have happened with all institutions, not just colleges and universities, but it got to stop. We need to be building a culture of evidence based on information. And so are the data available? Because many institutions are pretty good at it. They have strong institutional research offices, and they are able to develop models and options in addition to filling out all those darn reports that are required. And so data are critical. Second factor. The third factor is courage, as has been mentioned. I've seen a number of institutions will go through the process and then finally get up to that point where a decision has to be made, perhaps to reduce programs, eliminate programs, consolidate programs, all of which, as we know, are associated with personnel costs and with live personnel, real people. And they stop at water's edge. They will not jump in. And so I think it's a good time for a good old-fashioned gut check. If we got the alignment and we got the data, if we got the courage to proceed.
Can I just add one thing to what Bob was saying about, I should tell you that when I was writing the book about trusteeship, Elizabeth Hayford was helping me. And as I said, she's worked with 15 colleges that were almost all of them were pretty strong. And at the end, I mean, we spent most of our time arguing about whether or not these colleges had a good future or not, because I had worked with so many that don't. And I wanted, the editor at Johns Hopkins really sort of wanted us to do a chapter where I took the positive and she took the negative. I mean, I took the negative view and she took the positive view, but we never did that. She wasn't comfortable with that. But there, too many cases, it's hard to define the school as being stable and expecting it to stay that way. Emory and Henry, which was the third school in my network that I would have said was pretty strong, at one point had an A on the Forbes financial classification, and 2 years later they had a C minus. So it's just hard to feel confident about any of these schools that I was working with, as I said, with the exception of Berea and Swanee.
Thank you. That is very helpful. All right, Senator Hank Brown, thank you for joining us. I want to be mindful of the time. We have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to get some audience questions. But before we do that, Senator Brown, I did have one question for you. When you were the president of University of Colorado Boulder, you inherited a less than ideal financial situation. So would you mind talking about what some of the first steps you did as president and the reaction on campus?
We were very fortunate in one way. The publicity had been so challenging and so bad that all the members of the university were really at a point where they knew changes had to take place. So we had great cooperation. But I think the first thing was to set an example. And we did it by eliminating several $1 million out of the president's office. And that set a tone for everyone else in the university. I think the second thing, because we faced such challenges with the press, was to be on the offensive rather than defensive. And we did it not by shutting things down, but by opening things up, being totally open and frank and addressing problems directly. One thing I would add for our trustees that I think is essential. So often trustees are presented a budget with a day or two to read it, and the budget may run several hundred pages or perhaps even more. And trustees, I think, often find that somewhat frustrating as you go through. The major point of advice I would offer is that a good budget and an impact by the trustees in developing a solid budget for the universities starts long before the budget documents delivered to the trustees. By then, they have a limited ability to make a difference in the university's events. But what can start is a year in advance or more. And the reason that's so important is because many of the changes in a budget, many of the economies in a budget that a university can achieve take long-term planning. One major factor, of course, would be obviously the ratio of tenured track faculty and tenured faculty to non-tenured faculty. A huge difference in their teaching loads and a huge difference in their cost. Those ratios can make a big difference in the efficiency of the university delivering its education mission. But that ratio can't change overnight. It has to be planned for well in advance. And I think that's with many of the savings that a university can achieve. So my recommendation for trustees would be to plan ahead, seek to lay down goals and objectives in terms of where your budget wants to go well in advance, even a year in advance or more for the administrators. That gives them a chance to look for economies, to sort through priorities. It gives them a chance to adjust the faculty ratio. It gives them a chance to address many cost areas. But trying to deal with a budget the day they present it is a nightmarish task. Most universities have areas where they can achieve economies. And the key is to give administrators an opportunity to know what the trustees expect and look for, what they desire, and the time to do it.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. Transparency has sort of been the theme of this webinar, I feel like. So it fits in. What was the reaction from faculty when you changed the tenure system?
Actually, the university had strong support from its faculty, and not all of them, of course, but the tenure system at CU was, I think, strongly benefited by a renewal concept. That is, the people's tenure came up for renewal after a 5-year period. Some universities use a 10-year period. But I think the key is to make sure that the high academic standards and the research that you're paying for with faculty members has a system that encourages excellence and recognizes excellence. And we generally had good cooperation in that. Obviously, the other universities that I was at, I would say the reaction was much different. I think the strong reaction, the good reaction, was basically started with a faculty dedication to scholarship to begin with.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, that's what we can all hope for. All right, we have a little over 10 minutes left. Nick, do we have any questions from the audience that we can go over?
Excuse me. Yes, we do. Yeah, we have a few. For this one, anybody can answer. Dr. Alice Brown suggested earlier in the webinar getting out and talking for trustees to get out and talk with faculty and staff and administrators. How would a trustee prevent overtasking with their questions? Should their inquiries be directed through the chair of the trustees?
That's too deep for me to answer. I'm not sure. I think part of it, the problem is that they just need to get out of that room and they would find something. But you're right. I don't think that the trustee ought to go give assignments to the people. When I was on the board of Colby Sawyer, I think Ann Ponder envisioned me helping their development staff. But after I met with their development staff, it was pretty clear to me they didn't want my help. And I've noticed that especially when the development officers are new or young and energetic and so forth, they don't want to be bothered by this outside view that they don't have any what reason to any experience with. In fact, it seemed to me in some cases they thought I wanted their job, which was very far from the truth. But yeah, I wouldn't want to overtax people with questions and ask for materials and so forth. I just think looking around a little more often would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, so another question we have here, how do mandatory student fees, which are controlled by the student governments, differ from tuition, which are controlled by trustees, in terms of growth rate over time and efficiency of expenditures? How are utility costs affected by the Green New Deal? And again, this question is not directed at any one panelist.
Perhaps I could respond to part of that. I think it's important to remember that the recommendations that students make with regard to the use of the fees is just that, a recommendation.
Right.
And the most successful, I think, programs start with the trustees and the administration laying down guidelines as to the functions that will be covered by student fees. Students are delighted to be involved, respond well to it. But obviously, they, like all of us, will benefit by guidelines by the administration. Let me give you an example. There's a temptation by student groups to respond to special interest groups, just like I think any legislative body does. Guidelines that help people understand that you don't cater just to a small group, but you look out for the general good, I think are very important. And I think it's important not to allow student fees to become a way of advancing one political party or one political interest over another on campus. Generally, student fees are best used when they go to functions that relate to student activities on campus, not to political parties.
Let me just comment on that. Hank is absolutely correct. But it's also important for trustees to understand that students do not control student fees. Student fees, like all tuition and other fees, are a condition of registration, are a condition of enrollment. And only the trustees make that decision. Don't think you have to delegate that off anywhere. It's your responsibility.
Okay. Excuse me. So another question we have here, when speaking with donors or potential donors, how much transparency is appropriate?
A lot.
You want to
Very
expand on that?
You don't want him to give you $200 million and then find out that there was something he didn't like about the college.
That is a great observation. Obviously, I found most donors are interested in a particular area themselves and may not be interested in what the administrators or the people asking for the money are interested in. And it's a great revelation to faculty members to, when you get them involved, obviously they can be very helpful and very effective with it, but it's a great inspiration to them to understand that raising money often is about the wishes of the donors, not so much solely the faculty members.
I want to comment on one of ACTA's services, incidentally, and I'm biased because I serve on their advisory board, but ACTA has a program called the Fund for Academic Renewal, FAR, and the Fund for Academic Renewal provides counsel both to institutions and to donors on how to make sure that donor intent is followed and that academic needs are met. It's a wonderful program, and I recommend it to donors and trustees as a service that ACTA provides that I think is just excellent.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I mean, thank you for saying that because they do great work here.
I'd like to follow up on a comment that Bob made earlier. It's one I suspect you've talked about a little earlier, but there's wonderful comparative data available from the federal government. And ACTA, I think, has a program where they've helped trustees use that data to come up with great comparisons on their campus. And it goes all the way from comparing salaries for comparable positions to administrative cost, to allocation of faculty in specialty areas. That national data can give you a great background in terms of managing a university and setting guidelines. The key, I think, in all of this is you use that data is to make sure that you're looking at comparable universities. What most universities do is perhaps not unlike most corporations. When they compare themselves to other people, they compare themselves to the most costly, expensive, and marvelous programs anywhere in the world. And so your first job as a trustee really comes in making sure that you're looking at a comparable group.
Yeah,
the breakdown that's available is absolutely wonderful once you use it that way.
Right. The question is it a realistic peer or an aspirational peer?
That was Dr. Hendricks. That was one of, I mean, I just happen to know this. When you were starting your dashboards, that was something that you used when creating the Tulsa dashboard.
Yeah, one of the reasons I got into this business was in part because of the benchmarking study that the University of Tulsa did. So sort of in response to what was happening on campus and things we were digging up out of the iPads data. But we found out through the grapevine that a good number of the peers in their funded study from a major consulting firm, they picked and they weren't necessarily right. They weren't, they're more aspirant than they were true peers. And I thought about that for a long time. How can I fix this and make it better? And so now I use only machine learning to select the peers. That doesn't care about who you want to be, or it only cares about who you are at the moment. So it's a nice objective way of picking peer institutions. Just let a AI do it. That's basically what I'm using at the moment.
Okay, I believe we only have time for one more question here. And again, this is open to all the panelists. Can you provide examples of how institutions have effectively used their trustee skill set appropriately across the respective institution within the guardrails of appropriate governance?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I did some time ago a board engagement plan, and it's very simple. It seems to me that there are a number of services that an institution requires that it has to pay for that are quite expensive, and we may not be able to afford them. At the same time, we have a number of trustees who have expertise in certain areas that are not being tapped. And joining those together is a simple process of linking interest with ability. The best example I know of occurred at an institution in the Midwest, a private university, that needed some city planning done. It needed some planning because it was going to have to divide its urban campus due to a highway construction project. To bring on the consultants to engineer that process and to come up with a plan would have been very costly. As luck would have it, a trustee had this expertise, donated his time. It was a win-win. The trustee felt like he was truly engaged. The institution benefited from that expertise. You can take that model, I think, and apply it in lots of situations. We don't need to go out and buy the service if it's available on a volunteer basis from our trustees, many of whom are more than willing to pitch in and help out, particularly an area where they have expertise.
You know, another example of that, Bob, is when Wheelock merged with Boston, the Wheelock board had a person on it who had spent most of his life on corporate mergers. And so it was fascinating to me to watch the process they went through in contacting similar colleges all across the nation. Now, they ended up with Boston College, which was a few blocks away. But nevertheless, what they did was just sort of amazing to me. And it was because this guy knew how do you deal with a merger. Mm-hmm. So, but the question is, how do you get those people on your board? That's the point. Most of the people on the boards that I work with are ministers. And I don't know how much these schools need their help beyond, well, they do tell me frequently that they're praying about it.
Well, getting the right trustees on the board can be another webinar.
Yes.
That's good
Be
thought.
part two.
Anna. So we do have a minute left. Do any of our panelists have any final thoughts before we sign off?
I have a final thought. We haven't talked
Sure.
about student debt. And student debt is a significant problem, and we know that there's a Supreme Court case coming, and I don't want to get involved with that or the politics of it, except to say that boards need to be very careful when they raise tuition levels. A lot of boards say, well, we're a high price, high aid kind of institution, and that's a myth. That's not true at all. Independent institutions right now are doing tuition discounting at 54.5% basis, according to NACUBO. That's the National Association of College and University Business Officers. That's an astonishing rate. You're getting about half the bucks that you're charging. And so sticker price has become a fiction. I think we need to fix that. And you talk about transparency and honesty and open dealing with people. I think a lot of students and their parents are frightened away by sticker shock, and when in fact it doesn't need to happen that way. That would be a significant problem. Finally, students who graduate have the ability to repay loans. Students who don't have that ability. And so focusing efforts on solid student retention. I'm not talking about grade inflation. I'm talking about working on the affect side of student behavior and really improve student retention. And it's a win-win situation for the institution, the students, their parents, and our society.
I have one additional thought I'd like to share with the trustees, and that is our allocation of financial aid for students. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read a book that just came out, principally by the former Senator Phil Graham from Texas, but he and several other PhDs in economics had developed a book that looked at the myth of financial need in America. The reality is most universities follow the federal government in their formula that they put together with regard to FAFSA. That is a federal financial aid formula, but it goes to adjusted gross income starting with your tax return. The problem with that is not a good measure of what resources a family have. One of the startling facts, I think, in the Graham book is that the take-home pay, when you adjust for taxes and when you adjust for transfer payments and welfare, the take-home pay of the middle quintile in America is less than the take-home pay of the lowest quintile in America. That must sound very strange to hear, but the reality is the federal formula that allocates student assistance ignores the impact of taxes, and it ignores the impact of transfer payments and assistance that way. Obviously, it's a challenge for any institution to make that adjustment because the federal government has such controls over universities as they develop those questions. But it's an area where I think all universities need to pay attention, because the way we allocate funds right now sometimes misses the most deserving students and rewards ones that have far less need.
I can make another comment. I think one thing the board should pay attention to too is the pricing strategy at the university. I just actually worked on a university very recently that sort of approached us to learn about how they could increase their revenues. And when I was doing the analysis, it was really clear that they have a huge budget surplus every year. And their price is really high, especially for low income students. And so you can break out the price strategy by income level, pay really close attention to how much you're charging your Title IV students under, say, 50,000 or so. Sometimes way out of whack, and your institution could be one of those. That was one of the recommendations I had for this school, is to significantly reduce their net price for low-income students, which means more need-based aid, essentially. Really, the elite colleges are quite low price typically for the low income brackets, and if you can afford to do it, as was the case with this institution, that's one way we can sort of fight this debt crisis.
Great. Dr. Brown, any last
Okay.
words?
I've already said enough, I think. I think I've had my fair share of the minutes.
All right. Well, on behalf of Anna and I, we'd like to thank all of our panelists and as well as attendees for joining us this afternoon. This webinar was being recorded and will be posted on www.goacta.org in the coming days. But thank you again to everybody, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon.